Well, it is just now 11 o'clock. So in the interest of getting through this wonderful material we're going to be covering, I want to go ahead and get started. Hello, I'm Susan Rennie. I'm co-director of Work to Include. Welcome to today and to an exciting opportunity to hear from a great writer, author, advocate. So those of you on the call who on the webinar today who don't know Work to Include, I thought I would just cover a couple of things about us. If I can find a way to move this forward. Come on. Sorry. So Work to Include is a coalition that started back in 2018, and our goal is to develop a cadre of people with disabilities and family members that are promoting competitive integrated employment. We in Indiana have a long way to go in terms of employment for people with disabilities, and especially people with more significant disabilities. So we've really worked with coalitions across the state that have been led by people with disabilities. And these are our three goals: to eliminate barriers and help to design a statewide system that works for everybody, with information and input from those who are receiving services. To develop local initiatives that work at dispelling the myths about community employment, both for employers and for people with disabilities. Because we know those are the things that get in the way oftentimes, the expectations that both employers and people with disabilities have. And then document the employment success of people with disabilities, because we do know that competitive integrated employment is possible and works for everyone. We just need to get the word out. So if you don't know us, please go to our website. Sign up for our newsletter. We put out a monthly newsletter, and then we have coalitions in different parts of the state that you can join. Just to make sure you know, we are recording this session and we're going to be archiving it at Work to Include. And we do have a chat function that's open, and actually instead of Q&A, I'm going to ask you to put questions as we go along in the comments section. And we'll get to those towards the end. There is closed captioning enabled, so you should be able to see that, and do let me know if there's any problems. So with that, I want to thank you for joining us today and turn this over to Doug. I'm so excited because I've known Doug for a long time. He's a wonderful advocate for people with disabilities. He has a sibling with a disability that he advocates for, but he's also a marvelous author. He's written many books, including books that aren't particularly about disabilities, but this book we're going to talk about today, I think, is groundbreaking in that it really does give us the history of subminimum wage and the history of the pushback on efforts to make that different, and the lack of voice that people with disabilities have had in making that happen, and the voice of the disability industrial complex in keeping things the same way. He's going to lead us in the discussion about that book. And so without further ado, I want to welcome Doug back to Indiana.
Happy Indeem 2022, everyone. Thanks for joining us. I'm going to take off video. There we go. So that this meager connection I have holds up. I'm in Douglasville, Georgia, and we have yet to secure high-speed internet, so we do our best. I am a Hoosier, and what that means is I started my career in Indianapolis and Hendricks County and Morgan County, and of course looked up to Susie and Pat, Steve Savage, Steve Hall, Patty Cassidy, so many others, with all the good work that has been done. You probably know Indiana has a rich history through the DD Council and elsewhere for really working hard to expand capacity. Well, we're going to have some fun today. It's short, it's brief. We will be giving away some books, so it might be good to take a couple little notes. We're going to give away 3, so your odds are pretty good at winning. But I want to start with another fellow Hoosier and put in chat for me if anyone has ever read about a person named William Merritt Chase. William Merritt Chase. If you have, or you haven't, just put it in chat so I know. This really has to do, this quote, with Endine. And I was struck by something in this quote, and I hope that, thank you, Gianna. Thank you. Appreciate the honesty. I knew who he was, but only vaguely. He's a Hoosier, but I want to read this quote. I think it's really pertinent to what we're doing. Thank you, Christine. So this is William Merritt Chase. Diversity is not polite accommodation. Instead, diversity is, in action, the sometimes painful awareness that other people, other races, other voices, other habits of mind have as much integrity of being, as much claim on the world as you do. And I urge you, amid all the differences present to the eye and mind, to reach out to create the bond that will protect us all. We are meant to be here together. Let me say that last part of the quote. We are meant to be here together. As we get to the end today, we'll ask you a little question about William Merritt Chase as one of the chances to win a book, plus a couple other questions. What I was struck by William Merritt Chase was, he was a painter, if you've been Googling, but that quote comes from 1890. Does that, it has the word diversity, accommodation, the painful awareness of being in tune with other people. It struck me that it seemed impossible that a Hoosier, really in the frontier in 1890, was writing in that way. Well, also would love for anybody to put in chat if you're a writer, and if you write, what it is that you like to write. And when I say a writer, that just means you're writing. Has nothing to do ever with publication. It has to do with the soul and spirit. So if you write poetry, let me know. If you're not a writer and you read a lot, I'd love to know what you like to read. Historical fiction, memoir, serious nonfiction. So please put that stuff in chat. I grew up in Wabash, Indiana, on a pig farm, went to Ball State University, and my first job with my undergrad was a job coach in 1990 that paid under $12,000 a year. I always have to say a year. People never believe that. So it is with a great honor to be spending time with you all, and so proud that you have work to include as your economic justice kind of centerpiece. Thank you, Emily. Nonfiction reader. Okay. Well, maybe you can win this book. All right. Reading biographies. Oh, Gina, political history junkie. Oh my goodness. Well, I hope I'm saying it right, Gianna. The history of corruption in this story is what drove me to write it, and I think you'll get that. Jennifer, I wrote a true crime book called Fear Came to Town. It's about the Santa Claus, Georgia murders. There's a town called Santa Claus, Georgia. And Gregory, you're writing screenplays, fiction, and novels and short stories. All right, Gregory, let's connect. Would love to know what you're doing there. Mary, you don't do much of that. Poetry is something I enjoy, and journaling. You know, journaling is so good for you, even if you don't consider yourself a writer. It's very much like meditation on the page. Thank you all for sharing this. I love this. Bonnie, you read everything. You love paranormal stuff. You'd fit right in with my wife. She loves the paranormal to the point it seems like she's sometimes trying to get ghosts to come to our house. So And I just love what you say here, Christine, about understanding the perspective of others. That's what we're doing in this work. I celebrate 32 years this month in our field. And just as a advocate, thank you, Deanne, for family members. I just want to thank you for your work. Well, let's jump into this, shall we? So why did I write it? If you are a writer, somebody might ask you that, right? I mean, some of my favorite writers, I want to know why, what was the creative impulse? And I'm not sure I understood why I wrote it until I was done. And I have a simple answer now. The reason I wrote 22 cents an hour is I could not answer when young folks coming into our field would ask me, why is sub-minimum wages still legal? I didn't have an answer, and I don't think that's a great way to live. And it challenged me for those young folks to think about that. Well, I want to start here with a little reading from the book. Now, I don't know about you, but when I was little and there were opportunities to go to the library in the school and sit down with friends and have a lovely librarian read to you, it was just, I thought, perfect. I wish we could do that as adults more. But sit back, relax, try to tune in to just this, I don't know, probably 3 minutes of reading. This comes from a chapter 5 in the book, and it's entitled The Olmsted Supreme Court Decision and Freedom Fighters. And there's a deep, deep connection to Indiana here. And I guess what I want you to do is jot down a couple of things that either are new to you or strike you in a way that invokes some greater thinking. Okay, here we go. On May 23rd, 1974, two men who had been in Indiana state institutions, Leo Sonnenberg and Gerald Hartnett, filed a class action lawsuit seeking compensation for labor performed while they were patients. The complaint contended that the plaintiffs were entitled to payment under the minimum wage and overtime provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Their lawyers also saw another legal angle, a violation of the 13th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which prohibits slavery and indentured servitude. The appellate court judge defined class members as, and I quote, all patient workers who've labored in the state of Indiana institutions for the mentally handicapped or mentally retarded from May 23rd, 1970 to December 31st, 1974. Obviously, they're using the language from the day. The appellate court found in favor of 7,400, and in quotes, patient workers, and awarded $28 million in back pay for jobs performed in the institution, ranging from working in a hair salon cutting other patients' hair, preparing meals, cleaning, working on vehicles, doing landscape work, providing nursing care, and even working in the institution's bowling alley. Most of these jobs were found to be full-time. In June 1991, however, the appellate court was overruled by the Indiana Supreme Court in what is known as By versus Sonnenberg, where the court found that the labor fit within the civic duty exception to forced labor. And the court says this: the court looks to whether mental patients' work had ever been compensated throughout history, because the Constitutional Convention records make clear the framers did not intend to create new rights to compensation. The 1816 Constitution makes clear that the institutionalized may be made to work when they are, in fact, institutionalized. End of quote. There was only one dissenting opinion. Justice Dixon found exceptions with the concept of involuntary servitude. Justice Dixon said, Other jurisdictions have found that patient labor does not fit squarely into the civic duty exception. The requirements of the extended full-time work go way beyond the civic duty requirement. And Dixon further argued that the right to compensation was not applied across the board. He said, working at the state's mental institutions was not required of all citizens. The labor of patient/workers was not demanded for merely a few days each year. It was required full-time during their confinement. Now, the fact that Dixon used the term citizen rather than patient, even if once, was promising, but there would be no $28 million in back pay for the 7,400 Hoosier citizens held captive in its institutions. But others would take up the fight in just a few years. I read that for a couple reasons. One, I read it on many of these book Zooms, but obviously it's more pertinent because we're in Indiana and talking about the systems there. But that's 1974. You hear a few echoes in there, and those echoes from both, I guess you could say, the past and future echoes we're even seeing now with something in Congress called HR 2373, which we'll get to. But I read it so that we understand the power behind trying to change things within the disability industrial complex. One of the most striking things I found, and maybe all of you were aware of this and I'm just naive, is how many millions of dollars were spent to fight over the last 5 or 6 decades the abolishment of 14C, which is the section of the Fair Labor Standards Act, ironically named in this situation, that permits 14C. All right, let me give you the rest of our structure here. I'm going to take you through some dates. And what I'm trying to do here is give you a quick narrative flash of kind of where we've been, some things to be aware of, all with the eyes on HR 2373, which is in the House of Representatives right now. You have I think 2, maybe 3 co-sponsors. Susie may know better than that, but I want to drive us to that end point. It's not the end of the book, but it's the end for us as advocates and people who care about economic justice. All right, so we'll do that. I think some of you had access to the discussion guide. There's a discussion guide for the book that has 10 questions, I think. We use it with obviously book clubs, but students and classes and in professional development as well. If you don't have that, it's at the website, which is abolish14c.com. All right, well, let's get into it. Well, the reason we want to pay attention to this issue, and many people have said to me, thank you, Joseph, he's put it in chat, thank you. Well, Doug, you know, a dozen states have banned it or have executive orders or legislation. You know, if a dozen states are going to do it and we have HR 2373, maybe we don't need to spend time on this, but I want you to hear this because this is the biggest takeaway. Understand that it was first passed in 1938, the Fair Labor Standards Act, that includes the ability to pay some workers with disabilities pennies on the hour. That means we're celebrating 84 years of that public policy. Did you hear that? 84 years of that public policy. Then it makes sense to assume that when HR 2373 is passed and that legislation becomes law, that we're looking at least 50, 60 years before that will be amended. And that's just history. So 1938, it's a Roosevelt administration. We've had one world war. There are accidents in manufacturing and farms. And we passed the Fair Labor Standards Act to do a lot of things. But if you don't know much about it, you have rights to unionize, to have overtime pay, to be safe, to collectively bargain, all of those things that we take for granted because of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Putting in sub-minimum wages in 1938 was not an evil, wrong thing to do. Policymakers thought, well, if we want private business to make a place for folks who are returning with service injuries or from combat, from foreign wars, if we want those who are being hurt on farms and factory floors, we need some laws. So understand, we're not even celebrating a century of having kids out of coal mines. So 1938 is the passage of the Fair Labor Standards Act. Now, it was always intended, the sub-minimum wage provision under 14C was always intended to be for private business. Those folks who were going to, if you will, have folks return to work after a significant injury. There wasn't 14C certificates for what we call community rehabilitation providers. It was simply to businesses. One of the things most people don't know is that there are 4 types of sub-minimum wage certificates. For private business, you heard the patient workers list, CRP, and then student worker experience program. As late as 2018, Southern California had nearly 2,000 students with disabilities under a 14C certificate around student worker. That is in complete violation, not only of Olmstead, but IDA as well. Okay, so not much happens, to be honest with you, in the history of this until we get to the 50s or so. I point out in the book, there's a great organization in Memphis that had been a local ARC, and moms get together to make sure that the kids that they've had who have turned to adulthood are able to stay home, not, i.e., not be in institutions. And to do that, even when during a time when the economy was largely manufacturing, what they did was go door to door in Memphis selling baked beans, cans of beans, so that they could do this thing they had heard of called a sheltered workshop. Those moms loved their children. They were doing what they thought was right. Doesn't make them bad people, it makes them actually visionaries of the time. The true center of this narrative is how public policy can be hijacked. Now, we know in retrospect that, of course, sub-minimum wages only produce more sub-minimum wages, that segregation produces all types of different of abuses. And so the 50s and 60s roll on, and a few community rehabilitation providers get these certificates. But by the 70s, it is so prevalent, it's ubiquitous. It's all over the country. It is by leaps and bounds, over 1 million folks on sub-minimum wages. Everybody thinks this is a grand idea. Now, I want to bring you, before we hit 1986, I want to bring you to a milestone that won't echo out until 2009. And this happens in Des Moines, Iowa in 1979. A wonderful journalist, a woman who did lots of investigative reporting. She's still working today. Here's of this program in Iowa, and it's called just Henry's Turkey Service. Henry's Turkey Service. Please put in chat if you know the story of Henry's Turkey Service. This will help me help you. So yes or no, if you have heard of Henry's Turkey Service, please. So thank you, Krista. She's really curious about, thank you, Emily, why this town called Atalissa in Iowa has given this for-profit, essentially slaughtering business, insemination business for turkeys, why they've given this bunkhouse to this guy, and why there are 30 men with intellectual disabilities from Texas housed there. That's 1979. These two front page stories were scathing, absolutely scathing. You can find them online, and of course, I condensed them in the book. They're scathing in 1979. I'm going to pause there. Remember 1979, 30 years later. So as the 70s roll on in the 80s, even in the 80s, as we're starting to figure out through Rehabilitation Services Administration, lots of strong advocates, many of whom were Hoosiers, that supported employment, really good supported employment, would replace the need for sub-minimum wages. It's a powerful set of principles. It was always intended to be and embrace the zero exclusion principle. It was never supposed to be placement like we've turned it into. But the powers that be within rehabilitation, Susie mentioned the disability industrial complex, start to get a little nervous, because the fact that people can work in their communities, in their local economies with support, good support, well-paid support, quite frankly, freaks them out, because their entire business model inside the disability industrial complex is set up for readiness, for people never leaving. And in fact, it doesn't even mirror how the rest of us go to work. We go to work by trial and error as youngsters. But the disability industrial complex says, you know, this is kind of powerful supported employment. We better do something. And the rise of what I call state trade organizations begins in the early 80s and really picks up steam. I'm purposely not saying acronyms or names of those. During the webinar, you'll have to read the book if that's what you want to find out. But they're powerful. And they then begin to form national trade organizations. So much so that one of the most strange, ironic, and in fact, inane terms comes up in 1986. In 1986, the lobbyists successfully get the US Department of Labor, the Wage and Hour Division, to remove what is known as, this is the crazy part, the minimum sub-minimum wage. The minimum sub-minimum wage, which is just ridiculous. And it's successful. Lots of trade organizations are at these hearings and these committee oversights. And in 1986, we see what will play out over the next 4 decades. And that is that we can pay people pennies an hour. Prior to the wage floor being removed, there was an agreement with Wage and Hour that community rehabilitation providers would not pay less than about half of the current minimum wage. But that's gone. And more importantly, and maybe more insidiously, what happens is the disability industrial complex knows it can lobby. It knows it can use resources, money, time to successfully derail supported employment in a large way. Well, the 80s goes on. I start work as a job coach in 1990, but the 90s see a lot of what's in Chapter 5, and that's the Olmstead Supreme Court decision. The Olmstead Supreme Court decision is very important. It's important because it has been used both in the Oregon lawsuit around sheltered workshops, was just recently closed this past year, and currently with the Rhode Island consent decree, which was a 10-year Department of Justice consent decree with Rhode Island in violation of ADA and Olmstead. But what Olmstead did is very interesting. But the 3 women I spent some time on, by the way, almost all the heroes in this story are women. All of the villains are men. But an attorney named Sue Jameson right here in Georgia met two women who were in institutions, very much like our reading from Leo Sonnenberg in Indiana. And Lois Curtis and Elaine Wilson, along with their attorney Sue Jameson, won a test, Title II of the ADA, which simply says, in a nutshell, that people should have services in the least restrictive environment, and it needed to be tested. So we were only about 6 years in after the passage of the ADA when Olmstead begins to be litigated, and they win a Supreme Court decision. And Lois Curtis, who is a phenomenal human being, and Elaine Wilson as well, get long-term Medicaid waiver services. They both had worked in many institutions in Georgia under that patient workers list for sub-minimum wages, and they wanted to work and to contribute. Elaine Wilson unfortunately passed in 2010, but before passing, she got to spend her time doing PowerPoints, presenting to groups, advocating. She's a wonderful person. She loved to wear pearls and dress up. These three women are heroes. You must understand this is considered the Brown versus the Board of Education and Disability Rights, the Olmstead Supreme Court decision. Lois Curtis, still alive and well, won the Harriet Tubman Award for Courage in 2007, visited the Obama White House in 2013 and gifted one of her beautiful paintings to President Obama. Well, now, right, it's 2000 or so. The Olmstead Supreme Court decision is really putting some pressure on this idea of where people spend their days, not just residentially, but vocationally. So you would think this might be a turning point. So in 2001, once again, by the way, there are over 100 hearings and subcommittees and oversights and reports about sub-minimum wages dating all the way back to the 60s. Again, why did I write the book? Because I wanted to understand how it was possible that it could still be legal. And the simple answer is money and influence. But in 2001, we have Olmstead, we have the ADA, and once again, we try to pass legislation that gets shot down by those same trade groups. Not a lot happens in terms of sub-minimum wage from 2001 to 2009, other than that for the first time in the history of the United States at the Department of Labor, a subunit is created known as the Office of Disability Employment Policy. Now that's really important, but it's also pretty shocking to think that we're only celebrating about 20 years of actually having a subunit of government at USDOL represent the needs and supports and desires of workers and citizens with disabilities. And ODEP puts out RFPs for customized employment, and those are funded in about 22 states, and lots of great findings come from that. But I told you, right, we would return to Atalissa, Iowa in 2009. 1979, as I mentioned, great investigative reporter does the front page news stories, and no one does anything. It's very clear that the men are being mistreated, that they are being abused verbally, at least in 1979, and it doesn't get fixed until 30 years later in 2009. And once again, the hero is a sibling and a woman of a man who had been working at Henry's Turkey Service. And finally, we close it down 30 years after knowing how abusive it is. And what comes to light is horrifying. The men are only there because of USDOL sub-minimum wages and housing credits. They were making $65 a month, working alongside men who were being paid $10, $11, $12, $13 an hour, gutting turkeys, inseminating turkeys. They had to live in a rat-infested, horrible bunkhouse in Atalissa, Iowa, which was finally bulldozed in the last couple of years. But that's the reckoning our field had in 2009. And from that, the National Disability Rights Network ends up authoring a white paper called Segregated and Exploited in 2011. And that gives us now another chance as a country to say, all right, in 2011, we've had some pretty significant changes. ADA, Olmstead Supreme Court decision. We've had the Work Incentives Act passed so people can get good counseling around benefits and going to work or returning to work. I mean, all these things are in place, but what stays locked in the amber, what stays preserved, are these sub-minimum wages. And in 2012, we try one more time. And this bill in 2012 is called the Fair Wages for Workers with Disabilities Act. The Fair Wages for Workers with Disability Act. And guess what? There's a trade group that spends $1.1 million lobbying against the Fair Wages for Workers with Disabilities Act, and it in fact does not get passed. We try again. In 2014, some Hoosiers involved in this, and others. 2016, there's something. And John Butterworth had been tracking this for a number of years. Sorry, Susie. Sounds like I'm cutting out. I'm going to pause just a little, see if that helps. And Susie, just put in there if there's anything I can do. Okay. I may have been getting too excited and talking too fast. 2016, the Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act passes. And as a nation, we tell families, youngsters, youth with disabilities, adults with disabilities, we can still pay you sub-minimum wages if we choose. That's our current policy. That's where we are in a nutshell. But we have this wonderful opportunity. If you Google HR 2373, you will probably get to, I think it's congress.gov, and you can sign up for alerts. It is known, HR 2373, as the Transformation to Competitive Integrated Employment Act. Now, over the last 3 or 4 years, both in Raise the Wage Act, Build Back Better, and elsewhere, the provisions about sub-minimum wages have been addressed. At the end of September, President Biden specifically mentioned sub-minimum wages. And people ask me, well, what are the chances of HR 2373 becoming law? I think 100%. The real question, though, is what will be in it? What are the unintended consequences that we would be putting into new legislation that in hindsight, like 1938, we could say that might be a problem? And there are several. One is the Butterworth research I was mentioning. I interviewed John for the book and several other folks who track this kind of thing. And we've seen a rise in non-workday activity programs. Community rehabilitation providers should not be allowed to simply move someone from what had been sub-minimum wages, pre-vocational, enclaves, whatever name we give it, and give them a life of segregation in a non-work day activity program. But that's the unintended consequence if we don't pay attention to it. There's some others. There are people arguing that inside of HR 2373, let's keep it legal, just like we did in 2016, but put a few more provisions on it. Don't let that happen. 84 years is long enough. The tool does not work. It hasn't worked for many decades. It's time to innovate, include, focus on intended outcomes and consequences, but more importantly, the unintended. You may have seen that Indiana is one of them, I believe, that the Rehabilitation Services Administration last month awarded 14 states millions of dollars, $177 million in total, under a category in the Disability Innovation Fund called Sub-Minimum Wage to Competitive and Integrated Employment. That is only a start. But as I tell folks, if you're working in our field and you care about this and your state got one of these grants, know what they're doing. That can be in terms of helping. It can be in terms of monitoring. These are 5-year grants, 177 million. That's not small potatoes. All right. We promised to be done. I don't know what's happening here. We promised to be done by 11:45, but I just want to check chat. We got books to give away. And thank you, Krista, and others for putting stuff in chat. Thank you. All right, you ready for the book giveaway? All right, you get 3 opportunities. Oh, okay, Krista is on it. So the first person in chat for each of these questions gets a book, and I think Joseph, my coworker, Harrison, is on the line, and I think Joseph will make sure to get your mailing address. And let's take a peek at some of these questions. Okay, you ready? All right. And these can be simple one-word answers in chat. So make sure you have your device open. If you don't have a device in front of you, I don't know, just guess. Okay, the first question is about a person. Who was Roland Johnson? Who was Roland Johnson? Definitely one of the heroes of this story. Who was Roland Johnson? First person to answer will sign and mail you a book. I think, Jennifer, you get it. You get it. I don't know if you Googled or not, Jennifer Olson, but Roland Johnson, who passed away, there's a great New York Times obituary. They do a series. I think the series is called No Longer Overlooked. Thank you, Carmen. Jennifer gets it. He helped found Self-Advocates Becoming Empowered. Roland was a fascinating, wonderful person. He had a ghostwriter. I guess it wouldn't be a ghostwriter. Anyway, somebody who helped him write his memoir. You can get it on Amazon. It's a great read. Roland Johnson, truly a hero, not only in this story, but in disability rights in general. Okay, Jennifer Olson, please let Joseph know where you want the book mailed to. And if you want it signed to you or just signed so you can sell it on eBay. Okay, second chance. You ready? All right. This is about Indiana. And so these last two are all about the Hoosier State. I'm from Wabash, Indiana. And there are 2 correct answers here. What is Wabash, Indiana known for? What is Wabash, Indiana known for? Manufacturing. I worked at the ceiling tie there. Wabash River, Wabash College. Nope, guys. Wabash College is not there. Joe Foster wins it with first city with electricity. And the Miami Indians watched the little town get lighted up with electricity from the banks of the Wabashiki River. So way to go, Joe. And of course, Krista and Jenna got it too, but a little late, Krista and Jenna. Dang it, I'm messing it up. Okay, Joe, let Joseph know where you want the book sent and how you want it signed. Oh, you're in North Carolina. Okay, all right. I think that's what that means. Okay, last chance, kiddos. Now, this harkens back to the William Merritt Chase. So I'll give you a little time to type before I ask you the question for the third book. And I will say, Indiana, on these Zoom book events, we're only giving 3 books away in one state, and that's this state. I failed to mention that Susie Rennie and Pat Rogan wrote blurbs for the book. And if you've never done that, it just means you got more work to do. And I'm so indebted to both of them for writing blurbs for the book. Thank you. Okay. So it's kind of 2 questions. Oh, thank you, Bonnie. Thank you. So William Merritt Chase was born in Williamsburg, which is now known as Nineveh, right? I think that's in Johnson County, right? Close to Gnawbone. When that's a whole nother story. Gnawbone's a great place to visit. Okay, how did Nineveh, Indiana, get its name? How did Nineveh, Indiana get its name? Final book. Bonnie wrote what? Yes, Samantha gets it. Samantha, I thought it too, Gianna. There was a Bible. And Emily and Bonnie, I thought so too. Of course, I'm sure the Nineveh berry was named after the Bible, so I'm sure that's how we get that. But yes, Samantha, you got it. A deer hunter fell in a creek named Nineveh. Okay. All right, we'll send you those 3 books. Guys, I have had such a good time. I want to thank you for paying attention, going a couple minutes over. Please let Joseph know where you want the book signed and sent. And I just thank you all so much. Stay in touch. Susie, Pat, thank you for having me. I've enjoyed it so much.
Thanks so much, Douglas. It's wonderful. And everybody go out and do something to recognize National Disability Employment Awareness Month. Thanks.
Yes. Woo! Thanks, everybody. Bye. I'm going to wave you out. I love waving Zooms out. Okay. No one's hanging up. Thank you, Natalie. Thank you, Natalie. All right. Thank you, Bonnie.
Oh,
Yes.
Bonnie,
Take care, Gregory.
Disability
Glad you won the
Talent
book.
Showcase coming up.
Ooh, cool. Really? When is that?
I think it's the 20th. Is that right, Bonnie? Are you still on? Yeah, she's still on. Yes, there you go. October 20.
October 20th.
If you want
Thank you, Charles.
information, Bonnie can get you information.
I would love to see it, Bonnie. Please send it to us. Thank you, Krista. Oh, yeah. 1 to 2, October 20th. I am really interested in that. I want to hear more about it. All right, Susie. Thank you so much. I'm going to hang up.
Thanks.
Thanks.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.